So a very warm welcome to today's BA community webinar. As you will have seen from the title, we're going to be talking about digital product management. And this is designed to be a very interactive conversational session. Now, I will get our speakers to introduce themselves in just a moment, but you will almost certainly be aware that they actually literally wrote the book about digital product management, which was released by BCS, the Chartered Institute for IT, and yet another reason to wait for to stay to the very end of the session is BCS have given us a 30% discount code. So I will let you know what that code is at the very end of the session. Just before we get started and get into the conversations, I also wanted to just throw out a big thank you to BCS for giving us that code, and also, of course, to our sponsor, the Building Business Capability Conference, which is live in Las Vegas. There are many good reasons to attend conferences, to go and meet other BAs. The Building Business Capability Conference, always a highlight. So do check out that website as well. And if you can get there, well worth it. So do check that out. So do remember, you can ask questions at any time in the Q&A. I'll try and keep an eye on the Q&A and the chat window. So we'll get started. And what I'd like to do first is just get all three of our panelists to give a brief introduction. So I'm going to set you the 60 seconds or less challenge, which is really unfair given how experienced and how many things you've all done, but we'll give it a go. So Sallie, how would you describe yourself?
Thanks, Adrian. So I'm a product manager at the moment for a scale up in the property space. And we help organizations who own a lot of buildings to manage data about risks within those buildings. But I haven't always been a product manager. I started out as a business analyst, went to being a lead business analyst, and I've spent that time doing the product owner role as well. So I got very interested in the differences between these roles and sort of how they interact. And I started talking to people about that. And yeah, gradually that's how I got into a conversation with Kevin and Filip. And we ended up sort of writing the book together.
I love the way we ended up writing a book together. You say that like that's just a normal thing that would happen one day. But yeah, no, that's awesome. So, and what a really varied, interesting career, Sallie. So, fantastic. So, Kevin, how would you describe yourself?
So, hi, I'm Kevin Brennan. I'm currently a business architect, in fact, at the University of Toronto. Before that, I was a consultant doing training and workshops, and for that, I was the Executive Vice President of Product Management and Development at IIBA. So I led the development of the BA BOK, managed IIBA certification programs, worked with our chapters around the world, and did a ton of other things in getting IIBA off the ground and growing it up to a mature organization. Yeah, these days I'm working on transitioning U of T to its next generation student systems, and we are currently undergoing the transition to a product-centric organization and away from traditional project management and project orientation. So that's going to be interesting.
Wow, I can only imagine. And I'd imagine there are different faculties and challenging stakeholders and all the things you'd expect in an educational environment as well. So
and a very large one. U of T has around 100,000 students, many of whom are international. So yes, there are a great number of different faculties and groups within the university that I interact with and have to work with to try and get us to where we need to be.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thanks, Kevin. And so last but by no means least, Filip, how would you describe yourself?
Thanks, Adrian. I think that I always tell something different when I get this question, so I'll try again. I think most of the things I do are about inspiring people on their business analysis journey and the combination of business analysis and innovation. So I do a lot of training, coaching, public speaking, writing on that topic. Coming from a background of software development, as many of us, I think, and actually even the first project I did hardware development. So I have quite a broad background, but today it's mostly inspiring people through the activities that I do.
Fantastic. So yeah, thanks, Filip, and it's a wide range of experience in the room. So that brings us to our first question, really, because of course the title of the book is Digital Product Management. And it would be remiss of me if I didn't start, by saying that within the business analysis and change communities, we're hearing more and more about product management. It's something we're probably talking about in our day jobs quite a lot. So 2 parts to this question. How would you define it? So how would you define product management? And sometimes it's helpful to define something by what it's not or by how it's different. So how would it differ from, say, project management? So who would like to have a go at that wide-ranging question?
I'll start. Sure, I'll take this one. So I think the fundamental thing to understand about product management specifically is that it is, and I know this is going to sound obvious, it's about products. And when we say products, what we mean is you are building something that is going to be put out there in a market of people, right? It is not about meeting a specific defined group of stakeholders who you can name, right? As we often run into in business analysis, where we are working with an organization, we know who our stakeholders are. But in product management, you are understanding the needs of a market. You are having to figure out who your customers actually are, what makes them different, and what unique needs that group of customers has for, that separate them from, say, other customer segments or other customer markets. It's also about, I think, so if you want a definition, it's about defining a product for market and taking the overall responsibility for guiding that product towards success, which means figuring out what features and capabilities you're going to need, how you add that, and when, what will make you differentiate yourself from competitors, and how that will help your product grow and succeed by whatever metrics or standards you're using it to measure. It's different from project management in that a project fundamentally has a beginning and an end. It is about delivering some set of capabilities or requirements within a defined scope, time, and budget. Product management, particularly digital product management, has no scope. There is no defined, rigid boundary of what you're trying to solve. It's built around the customer needs. Right, so you need to actually continually evolve and develop the product as time goes by. And since I figure I've talked enough, I'm going to hand it back to you, Adrian, or maybe one of my other co-panelists would like to jump in and add to that and give their own perspective.
Thanks, Kevin. And it's interesting because, and this is a complete curveball, but it was reminding me of Alan Kelly, who some of you, maybe all of you know, but he would often talk about continuous digital, where actually, stuff's never done. It's not a project because it's ongoing, as long as the thing is in its life cycle type of thing. So so Sallie, I mean, what would you add to Kevin's pretty extensive definition there?
Yeah, I think Kevin's covered a huge amount there. But yeah, I think as well, it's about the continuity of your team. So if you are working on a project, one of the sad things about working on a project is sometimes that you come to the end of that project and your team sort of goes its separate ways and perhaps forms different teams. If you're working on a product, then the chances are that you'll continue on evolving that, changing that product. But also that, products do have a lifespan, and you might come to a point where your product evolves or parts of your product need to kind of reach the end of their life cycle and become something else. So that's quite a key difference as well.
That's really interesting. So, I mean, and sort of riffing off that a little bit, Sallie, it sounds like there's a strong element of strategy there in terms of product strategy, but presumably that's got to link to the organizational strategy. So you've got to have that connected view. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes, you absolutely want to hang your product strategy off your organizational strategy, but it does go both ways. And sometimes, you might be saying, hey, there's customer groups, or there's a kind of market here, what we could expand into, and it becomes a bit of a two-way conversation there as well. So, much more so than when you are working on a project. And particularly if you're working in a business that's quite a product-led business, you're absolutely at the heart of those conversations about, where do we go next, and how do we shape the future of this organization, which is really exciting.
Yeah, definitely. I like that idea of that two-way, that sort of co-evolutionary dynamic with actually the product experience with the product can lead to the organizational strategy shifting, and the organizational strategy shifting can lead to the product changing, and so on. So there's that co-evolutionary type of dynamic there. So Filip, anything to add?
Maybe not so much add, but it appeared in both the other answers. It's the focus on value. Projects traditionally focus more on getting the output out of the door. In products, that's just when it starts. And are you getting value from that product? You, as an organization, your customer who pays something, money, effort, time to use your product. So that's, I think, an important difference, or an important nuance in product management versus project management. Yeah.
And Filip, actually, that brings nicely in a question that's been asked anonymously, actually, in the Q&A, is how can we determine like the market needs? How can we foresee the value that can be added to a product, or that a product can help a customer realize, without like a customer actually ordering a feature, right? So there's that whole thing about, you know, the difference between what people say they'll do and what they actually do if you've got something to sell them. So I mean, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the Henry Ford quote about horses and cars comes to mind. Well, listening to what customers say is obviously very important. Observing what customers actually do is probably even more important. So that's a very good source of input. Whenever you try something, measuring, is this in one way or another triggering something? Is the customer using this? So it's really about learning to interpret what customers do and don't do. A question that really helps me to identify the potential new products or new features is if customers have a specific issue or struggle or problem with a product, how are they trying to solve it today without that feature being there?
Excel.
Yeah.
sorry, I interrupted you. But probably Excel.
If customers have an alternative solution, you could try to improve upon that. If they don't have an alternative solution, the problem is probably not that important. So that's maybe a very practical starting point to identify potential features.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll invite Kevin and Sallie to pitch in, but I'll extend it because Nita has asked, I think, a really good and related question here, which is how do you manage delivering or creating business value compared with delivering quick wins that don't have high value? And this is like, it's really funny. I remember hearing a speaker once, I can't remember who it was, saying like low-hanging fruit is okay, but it's often rotten and fermented, and it's very easy to get drunk on the low-hanging fruit, which I thought was a brilliant analogy. So, I mean, Kevin or Sallie, any thoughts on how do we focus on some of the big stuff as well as the low-hanging fruit? Or does it matter?
I mean, I think this is a perennial challenge, really. And I think it gets really to the heart of what is so brilliant, but also so hard about being a product manager. Because you have to constantly balance the things that you're really working towards. So those kind of strategic goals that you have and which are going to take time to deliver against those really sort of small but delightful things that people really want now, and which might seem to be great kind of quick wins. But if you do too many of them, then you're probably going to end up kicking some of those more sort of larger, potentially more kind of game-changing things further out, right? And so I think it's just about balance. Like, you're going to have to say yes to some of those possibly slightly fermenting, low-hanging fruit, because you've got to deliver some things quite quickly. And you've got to kind of keep people engaged and interested in your product. Like, no one wants to kind of wait ages and ages for things to change or to evolve, because you're going to lose a little bit of confidence there. Your product's not going to feel fresh if it's not got new things that are happening to it quite frequently. And so, yeah, you've got to make sure that every sprint, sort of every section of your roadmap has a balance of things that are short term and things that are long term. And it's really hard to get right.
Yeah, so it's kind of like give a little bit of hoppy, fermented ale is fine to keep the morale high, but just not too much. Otherwise, yeah, okay. So I'm probably laboring that analogy a little bit too much. But I mean, Kevin, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things to keep in mind as well as a product manager, right? You are typically being judged on the contribution that your product makes to organizational goals overall. And so the conversations you should be trying to have aren't as much about features, although those, you're not going to be able to get away from those conversations entirely, but much more about, if your target is to bring in a certain amount of revenue or add users or increase retention, right? How are the features that you're working on contributing to those goals, whatever they may be? And if you're in a nonprofit space, right, and it's not all about money, because it doesn't have to be all about money, you could be looking at other things that you're trying to measure as your impact as well, right? Whether it be, for elderly patients, it might be something like, are we reducing the number of times they return to the hospital after a visit? So being able to point back to those metrics and say, this is what we're doing about them, I think is pretty critically important. And impact mapping is actually a method that's been widely used in a lot of places to actually try and address that, to look at it through the lens of modifying and altering the behavior of people who are using your application.
That's great. Thanks for that as well, Kevin. And actually bringing in, we've got quite a few questions, so I'll try and weave them in naturally as we go along. But for Fabrizio, the fantastic Fabrizio, who I think probably a few of us or all of us might know, says some organizations have no products, they provide services. What's the difference and similarities between products and services? And I'll extend this because, there's a whole other discipline around service design, for example, right? And so, I mean, what's your view on services versus product and product management versus service design? Does it matter? I mean, can a product be a product without a service and vice versa? Who wants that difficult difficult hornet's nest? Filip looks like you look like you have an opinion.
Give it a shot. Well, my first reaction is, the difference between project approach and product approach is much bigger than the difference between product and service-centric approach. So if you can make that shift, you're already doing a very good job. So I wouldn't get too hung up on the difference between product and service. And these days, especially in digital product management, a lot of physical products are digitally enhanced through services. So you get a mix of things anyway. Ultimately, the question is, how can the combination of tangible product features and some additional services, digital or other services, enhance the customer experience and thus create more value for the customer and the organization? So I think a lot of approaches and techniques are very similar. The mindset is very similar. And once you get started on what are the differences, then you're probably already a long way ahead of the curve.
Yeah. So, Sallie or Kevin, anything to add?
Sure, I'll take the position that I don't think it matters that much in practice. I mean, from a lot of perspectives, we talk about products and services. Well, yeah, we develop a product, but there's a service component to it too, right? I mean, when I was at IIBA, a number of the products I had certainly had service components, like the entire certification process was in many ways more a service, at least as much as it was a product. There's a lot of overlap, and from a fundamental perspective of what they are, it may or may not matter much. It depends somewhat on your industry too, right? In some industries, they are deeply, deeply connected. In other things, especially when you're manufacturing physical products and shipping them out, they can be extremely different. So, there's a certain amount of it depends on where you lie in that sense too.
Yeah. And I was thinking, if I think about like my background as an employed member of staff was in insurance, and people talk about insurance, like within the industry, you talk about an insurance product. But actually, most people would call it a service, right? There's no real tangible thing there. You might get some documentation, but it's a service. But you can manage it like a product, right? You got these sorts of elements. But great. Okay. Well, let's move on. I want to move on to another question. And someone was asking whether I can hold the book up again, so I can definitely do that. It's digital product management. and it's published by BCS. We've got a discount code, which I'll share at the very end of the session as well. So we talked about product management, but why digital, right? Because the title is digital product management. Why specifically digital? Who would like?
I should probably take that one on, because the book started out as a conversation I was having with BCS before we reached a point where I realized it really made more sense to work with teams, and BCS made the introduction. They helped me meet Sallie and Filip I had met before, of course, and that the book evolved from there. But I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that product management covers a lot of stuff, right? It covers everything from, consumer packaged goods to construction to anything you could think. And it was just too broad a scope. It would have turned it into, a book 3 times as long just to get any basic coverage. So that's one reason. But the other thing I think that's really important is that digital products really are different from a lot of traditional products in the product management space. If you're building a piece of hardware like an iPhone or a computer, there's a point where you ship it and it's done, right? And anything that you can't ship for that product is going to go in a future one. It's kind of fixed in a certain form. It evolves over time and it becomes obsolete. Digital products aren't like that. They are, they can continuously evolve. Adding new customers on a digital product is very different, because for the most part, scaling up most products digitally is trivial in comparison to the cost of making the product in the first place, right? Adding another user and then another user, yeah, there's a little extra cost. Yeah, maybe you have to rent more servers, but it really changes the game in terms of how your markets can grow and shrink and transform in time. And I think that it requires a somewhat different perspective than other forms of product management.
Fantastic. Sallie, would you add anything to what Kevin said there?
Only that I suppose one of the things for me that's really, really interesting is how different and it's slightly comes back to what we're talking about with services, about how different things can become when you translate them from a sort of offline world into an online world. And a lot of the kind of products that we're talking about would have started as a service that was entirely online, that wasn't digital. So if you think about something like banking, for example, which has gone through a huge transformation, or insurance that you mentioned earlier, that would have once been quite a face-to-face or phone interaction. And those sorts of journeys become a little bit different when you move them online. And so you've got to kind of shift how that looks and what the sort of outcomes are that you want into a quite a different world. And it's very tempting to just sort of try and recreate what you had previously.
Yes.
But it's not the same thing. And the experience becomes quite different, and you've got to think about who it's really for, and what's going to be different in the digital world when you're thinking about a digital product rather than a physical one.
That reminds me of something I think it was Roger Bolton said in the past, which is, digital transformation isn't just scanning the post, right? That might be an incremental change, but you're just creating a digital replica of something that, some technical fossil type of thing. So I'm going to just do some quick fire reading out of questions and chat messages. So Alice makes some really good observations that there's next level business models like a service with a smart product, and he goes on to say, like with Apple, the experience is the product, which is there's that really interesting element there. And there's a lot of questions coming in, and I'm going to have to kind of paraphrase some in themes, but there are some coming in around careers. And apologies if I pronounce anyone's name incorrectly, but I think it's Karunya in the chat has said, from a career standpoint, how do you move from a BA to a PO to then a product manager, as it seems like you folks may have done that already. And then Michelle asks, what experience does a product manager need of the market in which they are operating? So like is a sales background an advantage? There are, like, if you think about careers and BAs, what's the route? Is there one route? I suspect the answer is no, but what do you reckon? So Filip, you laughed first, so this one's yours.
There most probably is more than one route, absolutely. So I can give you my route, and it kind of happened a little bit by accident and a little bit by interest, personal interest. I used to work on the backend processes and stuff like that, and internal tools in organizations on the consultancy assignments that I did. But I started being more interested in what's the external world. How are people working with this? How are people experience this internal stuff we are doing? How is this creating value for them? And by starting to ask questions around those topics, by starting to integrate analysis of these viewpoints into my work, seeing how it links the inside and the outside world, I kind of automatically moved into doing product analysis, let's say. And I was also being asked to help on product ownership and product management work. So it kind of organically one grew into the other out of interest.
So sort of that, to paraphrase, almost taking a step back, looking more holistically at the external as well as the internal. That's really interesting. Sallie, what would you add to that? What was your sort of journey?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be absolutely clear that people get into product management from all sorts of backgrounds. Like you would not, if you asked a group of product managers what their initial job was, you would get a really wide range of answers. Yes, some of them would have come from sales, some of them would have probably come from software development, some of them would have started out as BAs. But I started out as a BA, and so I can tell you a bit about sort of my path from that role. And it actually sort of happened by accident, really. I think so. Kevin alluded to moving from a kind of project to a product focus, and that's what happened to the organization I was working in. And suddenly I got this new job title of product owner, and I really had no clue what that meant at that point. And that was a bit of a journey of discovery, but I actually really enjoyed that role. And I kind of had to move away from sort of talking to all of my stakeholders and kind of forming different views and trying to make them agree a compromise, towards, you know, actually taking a little bit more ownership of that myself, and kind of making sure that I was empowered to make some of those decisions. And that was quite a big leap, I found. I had to sort of start thinking about that. And then when I moved from being a product owner, because as a product owner, you're sort of in charge of what comes out of your development process and making sure that it meets the sort of needs that your users have. But you're not always as involved with strategy, or not necessarily making sure that the market exists in the same way as you are when you take on a product manager role. I think that was again a bit of an extension. There's more things to think about when you're a product manager. You have to kind of be a little bit closer to what your competitors might be doing, for example, and to what the kind of trends are in your marketplace, which is sort of slightly outside your remit as a BA.
Yeah, so looking more outwards, again, that sort of outward looking, sort of to some extent stepping up a little, perhaps to look at, look more broadly and holistically. Kevin, anything you'd add?
Honestly, I'm going to say no, because I am the last person to look to for any kind of career insight. My career has been just essentially, it has always come down to whatever I planned, it didn't work out, and I end up somewhere else. And, my particular path to product management, I think, was very unusual. I got roped into IIBA in its early days. We hit a point where I had come on full-time as staff. I had initially been managing the IT. We had a volunteer, Michael Gladstone, who was interested in coming in as a CIO. And at that point in time, the research I've been doing made it fairly obvious that IIBA's key problem that we had to address, that I was equipped to address, was the professional development portfolio. So I moved into that, did product management for a while, have done other things since, as well as product management. It is, I think, as Sallie said, it is a different progression for everybody. If the big advice, though, is that if you are coming at it from a BA, you will do well if you are the kind of person who enjoys open-ended problems where, there is no right answer, there is no end state, and you have to, look through all of this complicated data and information available to you and figure out what makes sense as a way forward. If that's attractive to you, this is a good space to be in. If it's not, then and for a lot of people it isn't, and I don't mean that as any kind of negativity, right? But it's probably not the best direction for you to take if you are not open, if you are not going to enjoy ambiguity and having to come up with solutions.
Definitely, definitely. So, well, sage advice from all three of you on that one. So I just want to pivot and take a slightly different direction, because there's an area in the book where you talk about different product horizons. And from memory, I think you talk about strategic, operational, and tactical. And I just wondered if you could explain a bit more about what that means. And Kevin, I think that was one of your chapters, so probably makes sense for you to give the starting point on that one.
Yeah. And it actually touches into what I was just talking about, right? And what it means is fundamentally that as a product manager, you're going to have to be thinking simultaneously about what your product direction, vision, and strategy is on the multi-year time frame, right? The strategic sense of where are we going? What is this product about? Who is it for? What problems does it solve for them? And how are we going to make it different from other products? But you also have to at the same time be we talked about this earlier, and Sallie was talking about the challenges of looking at these different things, right? You have to be thinking about, well, yeah, we have this long-term vision, but right now we have our competitors doing things and our customers complaining about problems, and we have these issues. And so you have to be looking at that shorter-term roadmap over the next 3 to 9 months. And at the very same time, you're going to be dragged into meetings about what are we doing this sprint and what features are we prioritizing for the very short term. And you need to look across all these horizons because you need to link them together and figure out how you make decisions on a day-to-day basis that still take you in a direction that you need to get for your medium-term roadmaps and your long-term roadmaps as well. So, it is that switching back and forth between viewpoints on a fairly constant basis that is one of the hallmark challenges of being a product manager, I think.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Kevin. And actually, just again, building on that, because you mentioned roadmaps there, and it makes sense if you've got those horizons. There's probably some roadmap that's part of connecting them, although reality never quite goes as you plan it. But having a roadmap is better than not. And I mean, perhaps one thing that shows the current intention in any one point in time is a roadmap. And so, Sallie, I'm pretty sure you wrote a chapter which covered roadmaps. So, I mean, what would you say you mean when you say roadmap? Because I think quite often different people mean different things. And how does it relate to something like a backlog in, say, a Scrum, or other agile methods are available, but those type of backlogs?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I mean, roadmaps, sometimes they are the bane of every product manager's life. It's both the most kind of exciting thing you do, and also it's just the kind of most painful. I mean, the challenge really with a roadmap is that everyone is desperate to know exactly when the thing they care about the most is going to get delivered. It's very hard to sort of meet all of those needs in one document. And it's also, plays with the whole idea of certainty, because you are not going to be certain when these sort of goals or outcomes that you're going after are going to get delivered. And by the time you sort of reach the point where you might have sketched them in, the world is probably quite likely to have radically changed. Competitors will have done something else. Your kind of understanding of what your customers need may have shifted. Their understanding of what they want may have shifted. So you are kind of trying to build this thing on sometimes like a constantly moving world. And so if you kind of Google roadmaps, you'll see that a lot of product managers deal with this challenge by not putting a timescale on their roadmap at all, or they might have one that's quite loose in terms of things that we're going to tackle first, things that we're going to tackle next, and then things that we're going to tackle later. And it's your kind of understanding at the time of what order you're going to go after solving those problems in. But it's hard with that sometimes when you're showing it to people, because everyone goes, yeah, that's great, first, next, later, but when am I going to get that thing? And so you may end up having to put a timeline across it, and you may just have to be open about the fact that that's flexible and that the world will change. But a backlog, just to kind of bring that back to sort of what the difference is, a backlog is going to be a much more granular level of detail, because your roadmap will show kind of problems or the sort of outcome you're going after. but your backlog is more like a list of tasks for your development team. And by the time something's in your backlog, you're probably going to have quite a good idea of how you're going to solve that problem. So it's going to be broken down into much more detail. And the level of detail that you've got in your backlog that you need to build something should never really get anywhere near your roadmap. If you've got the same kind of information on that, your roadmap would need like an entire wall to sort of cover it.
Yeah. So, or several walls, and it's really interesting as you were talking there. What was striking me is that like almost that we as a community need to reassert the fact that a roadmap is not a Gantt chart, right? There's that's a key it's not project management in that sense. And the other thing, when you were mentioning not putting times on it, I used to work with someone who would only ever put quarters, like quarter one, quarter two, and then there's I didn't say which year. So it's like, oh no, I meant quarter one 2027 or something. But yeah, that's probably not a good idea to do that. So I do want to move on to another topic, but before I do that, I'm going to do some quick fire questions so we can cover off as many questions as we can. So I want to, so Michelle asks, is it possible for an organization to complete all change through a product management approach rather than project management? So for example, how would it work if there was, for example, new regulations that impact multiple products? And a number of us probably have worked on data protection type projects like GDPR in the UK, or I think it's POPI in South Africa or wherever. So I mean, Filip, what would your view on that be? Can all change be done through a product management type approach?
I'd say yes and no. I don't think it's one or the other. If you're developing a product, you probably do a series of smaller projects to get to a certain release with that product, and then you move on. And at the same time, the example that you give as an organization, when GDPR enters your world, you might have to do a project that covers changes in multiple products. So I think they coexist. That being said, I think it's valuable to see most of the things you do as an organization, most of the things you build as being a product and having a product life cycle, because that gives you that outside in, that forces you to take that outside in look, which is very, very important.
Yeah, definitely that outside in perspective. And I'll bring in a question from Susan here, which is, how do you manage a project that interrupts a product team's delivery? And this is probably the reality for many organizations, where there's actually project management and product management coexisting, sometimes in a functional and healthy way, and sometimes not. So Kevin, how would you handle that?
So I guess this gets a little bit complex, because it sounds like you are having different ways of handling change inside your same organization, right? And in that kind of scenario, I mean, I think what Filip was just talking about is, and the scenario we just talked about there is a good example, right? So you might have a project that is looking to do something like, regulatory change across a suite of products, right? And in that case, what you would need to do from the product perspective is that you would need to take that into your roadmap, right? And that's the point of having a roadmap rather than a Gantt chart. In this scenario, what we have is a new set of features, a new set of functions that has been shoved ahead of the other stuff that used to be what we thought of as high priority. And to deal with that, we're going to need to take it into whatever our product team's intake mechanism is, potentially ahead of everything else that's going on right now, and move that through on a timetable that fits the needs of the organization as a whole. Sallie, Filip, I don't know if you have more to add to that, because these days I work more at that portfolio level than I do at the individual product level. So, I think you might have some useful insights on dealing with that kind of matter that I wouldn't.
So, I mean,
yeah, go ahead, Sallie.
Thanks, Filip. So yeah, I mean, the way I've normally seen this happen is kind of exactly what you said, Kevin, is that there is usually a kind of organizational roadmap or a portfolio roadmap where there is an outcome that we've got to meet this thing. There is a deadline that's been kind of perhaps imposed outside the organization. And then the individual product teams who are impacted by that will take a look at their own roadmaps and make sure that those things are aligned, or as aligned as they can be. And there might be areas where you can take a look and say, well, here's the things that we absolutely must do. Here's the things that would be great if we could do that by the deadline, but it's not absolutely mandated by the kind of external reason to do that. And and you can manage it just like any other sort of product goal.
That's a really good point, actually, to bring in another question from Phil, who asks, how do you manage to keep the stakeholders engaged, particularly with funding, when your roadmap is loose in terms of timelines and potential changes? And this is, again, probably a really real challenge for many people, particularly if the organization is used to, waterfall type commitments, right? So how I mean, I'll throw that out to whoever wants it, because that's a really tricky one. Who wants that one?
I can have a go.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that a big difference is traditionally waterfall projects, you commit funding to an output and it feels very predictable and secure. Question mark, is it really true? No. In a product-oriented world, you try to focus your investments on goals you're trying to achieve for your customer and for your organization, value that you are trying to create. And you are spending money wisely, seeing, okay, are we getting some of that value back by implementing this or that part of our solution? So I don't think the investment commitment should be more loose than it is in projects. You should be able, if you are developing a product and you are somewhere in its life cycle and want to grow the product, you have to know that there is money coming in, money ready to come in if you show that the product has potential. If you're not sure that that money is actually ready for you to use, why would you do investments to try to grow the product? So I think the investment commitment is at least as important as in traditional projects.
That's really interesting. And Kevin,
yeah. So I think one thing to keep in mind about that too is that some of it is based on I guess a unrealistic assumption about how most technology groups get funded in organizations. I mean, the reality is that you have a development staff that is a certain size. It may increase or decrease over time, but it's not like in most organizations you have people who are only there project to project, that it's 100. You're not 100% contracted staff. You have and so the point of putting that and saying all that is that what happens in practice is if you have a certain number of developers who are doing a certain amount of work, right, they are going to produce a certain amount of code and functionality over the course of a year. And it's really a different mechanism of taking that in and prioritizing that and making that something that happens on an ongoing basis, rather than trying to say, okay, we have a project budget of 100,000 pounds, dollars, what have you. That's X number of developers, but we're going to assign these 2 people to it for 6 months, and that's where the spend comes from, right? I think fundamentally, in the end, there's a bit of a false dichotomy there to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, interesting. Sallie, anything you'd add to that? Because it is a tricky area, that one.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think just to summarize it, as a product manager, you've got to go after the things that add the most value, and one of those things is what's going to make the most money. So if you're looking at 2 different things you could do, one of them's going to earn the company more than the other, you're going to build the first one. To make it simple. And so in some ways, you're not really, you should be having those conversations. If you've got funding for something but it doesn't seem to stack up or make sense to do it, you need to have that conversation and say, well, those are other opportunities that we are costing ourselves by doing this thing instead of the others.
Yeah, which actually brings me to a really, I thought well observed comment in the chat from Alice, who says both a BA and a product manager are really about, it's like value manager. It's about maximizing, co-created value or whatever. So there's, I'm just going to read part of a question from Mark and link it to about 17,000 other versions of this question that have been asked in the chat as well. There's a very, very common theme coming up. So Mark says, in the digital product management book, there's a great illustration of the overlapping sets of activities between business analyst, product owner, and product manager. Quite a few people in the chat have asked, what is the difference between product owner and product manager? So has anyone got a quick...
yeah, I'll take that, because I think I wrote at least the first answer that appears in the book. It's actually pretty simple. A product owner comes from Scrum, and in Scrum, the word product that is really the thing that the product team is developing, right? The developers are creating. It's not a reference to a product as in a market. It's an output. It's a result of work. And the product owner role in Scrum is fundamentally about saying, okay, when the development team needs to understand what the priorities are, right? What's being built, how it's supposed to look, how do we know it's done? They have a single person that they can go to and get a definitive answer. And the purpose of that role is to eliminate any impediments or some set of impediments that development teams encounter when building their product, right? The Scrum Master is there to take away the other set of impediments, which is, making sure that they follow the rules of Scrum, making sure that the rest of the organization doesn't, jump in and break the development process or break Scrum, right? But that's fundamentally what a product owner does in Scrum. So a product owner is a relationship to the development team, and that product owner role could be filled by a business analyst, a product manager, a business executive, or anyone else, as long as that person is able to give the team the definitive answer about what they are supposed to be doing at this precise moment in time, right? That's really what a product owner is supposed to be.
And I suppose that Kevin highlights the importance of that person having the autonomy and authority to make the call at that point in time. So excellent. I think that's a really, really useful differentiation there. So I'm just going to do another quick fire question from there's loads of questions coming in, but what challenges would a product manager face by having their product developed by third-party software companies? Is it recommended? Who wants that tricky question? You're smiling, Sallie, which makes me wonder if you've got...
Yeah, this is a challenge, and to be honest, it is how most small companies begin. And the company I currently work for is the same. Sometimes you need to go and use a third party. It's really expensive to build a development team from scratch, right? Early days, you're probably not going to do that. But the challenge it gives you is that you have kind of another set of interests and potentially another set of ownership that are outside your business. Okay. And so as a product manager, that gives you some constraints. Someone else has all your resource. So if they get another big project that they want to work on, you're going to sort of have less kind of capacity on your roadmap, which is a huge challenge. And you're also not going to have total kind of management or ownership over that product. Where is your code actually sitting? Is it in your organization or is it somewhere else? And you've got to be quite careful with those relationships sometimes. So it's not that it's not recommended, sometimes it is the only thing you can do, but you do have to be a little bit careful about what your longer term plan is, right? And how you're going to manage that over time to make sure that you do end up being able to manage your own product.
Yeah, I think sort of springboarding from what you're saying there, Sallie, always know who owns the IP, the intellectual property, who's got the source code type of thing. I would imagine would be an important question. So great. So I want to pivot now to some slightly different angles. And one thing which I always think it's important to talk about in change generally is ethics, right? And if we think about digital, if we think about more automation, more automated decision making or whatever, clearly there's an ethical implication of that. I mean, I think a couple of us have mentioned banking, right? Well, actually, bank branches closing isn't good for everyone, right? So my question to you is, and this is the only trick question I'll ask, really, but who's responsible for ethics, right? Because, and the reason I say this is go into most organizations and say who's responsible for compliance, and there will be a clear answer. Ask who's responsible for ethics, and with a few exceptions, actually sometimes in academia and perhaps in in research environments where there might be, there isn't anyone. So is this an area we should be filling, do you think? He asks a very leading question. Well, you see, Philip, you've smiled now, so that's your question now.
Note to self, don't smile in Adrian's webinars.
People hardly ever smile when I'm around. I'm just not used to it, Philip. This is the problem.
The easy answer is we're all responsible. I do believe that BAs can and should take the lead in these things by asking the hard questions every now and then. One of the challenges is that it's so deeply embedded in the way we see and develop products and digital products. Simple examples are like games that are designed to be addictive. But you can also consider an application like Waze or any other navigation application. Could you live without one? Is it okay to design such an application, making it so good in a way that people can't live without it anymore? Or should you make it sometimes give people some kind of responsibility? So it's a difficult area to navigate. It's much more nuanced, much more tricky than this is good and that is bad. And I think as BAs, with our listening skills, with our ability to look at things from different perspectives, we are very well placed to feed that conversation, to initiate and feed that conversation. And there are a few interesting models that help you help you with the analysis. So I'll put them in the chat right away, a couple of interesting links. So maybe that's a starting point for the others to.
Well, I think that's a good summary. And while you were speaking there, Philip, I was thinking, good or bad. It's also, I guess, important to ask good or bad for whom and from whose perspective, because there are going to be different views on that as well. So that could be a whole webinar on its own. So I'm going to quickly move on before we get caught up in that one. And I'm going to ask all of you for one lesser known tool or technique. So from a chapter you wrote, can you give us a brief description, overview, or even just name a lesser known tool or technique that isn't as well known as it should be? So Sallie, what would your lesser known tool or technique be?
So there was one when we wrote the book that we just found we'd mentioned in every chapter, and we had to like go back and kind of take out, to stop repeating ourselves. And it was something called the Kano model. And it's about kind of looking for those things that are going to really delight your audience. And I think it's so easy to forget that. When you are, you're looking at what are the absolute must-haves, the things that are just the baseline that we must do, and then what are the things on top of that that are going to really enhance the performance and make it faster and better. You forget that sometimes there's just those little moments that actually it might not take a huge amount of effort to deliver, but that they really kind of make you laugh, or they make you kind of they make you kind of really enjoy the experience of using a product. So I think for me, that's the one.
Fantastic. That's a really, really good, really good idea. Philip, what about you?
One that I have already been using for quite a while, and I give it in every product ownership related course that I train, is the customer experience pyramid. It's very simple. It's just a pyramid. Bottom layer, functional needs. The middle layer, usability needs. The top layer, enjoyability needs. And it helps you identify, it helps you structure different ideas for improving your products. It helps you identify, are we focusing mostly on one or the other? Shouldn't we move upwards or sideways in the pyramid? It helps you identify what your minimum viable product could be. And I see at every training that I give how easy it is to initiate a very good conversation among stakeholders. So that's a quick and worthwhile starting point, the customer experience pyramid.
Customer experience pyramid. Excellent. Thanks, Philip. And Kevin, what about you?
Well, I think the one I would bring up in the product management community, it's a very well-known theory, but I don't think it's well-known for BAs, is the concept of jobs to be done. And the idea behind jobs to be done is that you should look at your product as something that a customer is, hiring, in quotes, to actually help them do a job, solve a problem or challenge that they are encountering in their real life. And the reason we frame it in the sense of this job is that we want product managers need to take a step back from, okay, this thing I'm building, right? It's like, my product might be a cup of coffee, but there are a lot of different reasons that people go and buy coffee. Some people buy it because they need a jolt of caffeine to wake them up in the morning. Some people might buy it because, they are coffee snobs and they can tell the difference between, Brazilian and Kenyan coffee, and they really enjoy the different overtones and flavors. Other people might, it's not so much about the coffee as it is about having the chance to go somewhere and sit down and have a coffee with somebody and talk to them. And each of those jobs, even though your product is in principle coffee, they present very different ways of thinking about the experience as a whole that you should be creating for your customers, right? The environment your coffee should be served in, what it needs to be like, and how you deliver it. And I think that taking that step back is a very useful tool in searching out those additional needs or additional desires that your customers may have that you are really in a position to fulfill.
Fantastic jobs to be done. Always a good set of techniques. So I am going to ask you one more question before we close, but just as I'm doing that, a reminder, the book that these folks wrote is Digital Product Management by BCS. I'm going to put a 30% discount code into the chat now. So while we are answering this final question, the publishers BCS have very kindly given us a discount code, which is valid until March the 31st. So go click through now. But my final question to you all is, like, what would in like a sentence, what would your biggest takeaway be that you hope people reading the book will take away? So Kevin, what would your biggest takeaway be?
I think my biggest takeaway that I would hope people get from reading the book is that, honestly, product management for, I think, a lot of BAs is a great opportunity for the kind of thing that we always say we're looking for. If you want to make an impact in an organization, if you want to be able to be in the room when decisions are made, going into the product management career path is a great way to do that. Product managers, there is unlike traditional business analysis, there is a pathway up through product management to director, VP, and C-level positions. It is a job where if you have the right mindset, you have the right way of thinking about this, and you enjoy these kind of open-ended problems, you can go a very long way as a product manager. And I would certainly encourage anybody who has that kind of aspiration to take a look at product management as, perhaps their next role.
And fantastic. So move into that potentially. That's a new role. Sallie, what would your biggest takeaway be?
Yeah, I think just that there is a lot of overlap between roles in the kind of product space, and that's not actually a bad thing. People get very hung up on kind of job titles and like who's doing what. There are a lot of different team structures. What really works for your product team is what's important. And so, yeah, I think, move away from kind of being really worried about job titles and just think about the work that needs to be done, because it's a really interesting space to be in.
Absolutely, the role rather than the title, type of thing. So excellent. Filip, what about you?
One of the things we haven't really touched upon, but I feel is really important, especially in product development, is as a BA, we're used to working with requirements. But if we're writing down the requirements of product, we should ask ourselves the question, how required is the requirement? Because most requirements are actually assumptions. And part of product development is turning these into hypotheses. How can I validate or invalidate whether this potential solution that will help us gain some potential benefit is true? Should I build it? Because there are so many other things I could be building. So looking at things from a continuous experimentation and feedback loop is definitely a key element.
Hypotheses of value. And Kevin, you want to jump in?
Yeah. unfortunately, I realized that I realized the answer I should have given just after I finished giving the answer I gave earlier. So
Excellent.
my real one true takeaway from the book, and I'm not just claiming what I said before, but the real thing I hope that people take away as a message is this: if you are in a product management role, there is no substitute for interacting with and understanding and seeing what your customers are going through and experiencing and doing. You cannot do it properly by simply sitting in the building and imagining what they want. You have to interact with them. You have to understand and develop a deep empathy for their problems, and then look for ways to solve those problems. And that is one skill set I think a ton of most BAs have, and that the BAs really can bring to the product management role, is that ability to develop that empathy with stakeholders and the customers, right? And I think if you can't do that, if you lose sight of what your customers are struggling with and what they need, you will probably not succeed as a product manager, no matter what else you do right.
And
Fantastic.
if I very briefly may, just to prove Kevin's point, many products that are really successful are built by people that were frustrated by something, and they built their solution to their own problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
it's the level of empathy you need to be successful.
Indeed. Well, we are just about at time, so all that is left for me to do is to say a massive thank you, Sallie, Filip, Kevin, for a really enlightening session. Thank you for everyone who attended live, or indeed, if you are watching the recording. If you are attending live, you will find in the chat there is a link to everyone's LinkedIn addresses. I'll put that in the chat again now. And I always think that with a if this was a real session, this is where we'd all be giving a round of applause now, right? There's no round of applause here, but connect with the panelists. It's always great, like a virtual round of applause there. So thank you all of you for your insight. I'll also again just mention our sponsor, the Building Business Capability Conference in Vegas. Sponsors are indeed one of the things that enable us to do webinars like this for free. So please do take a look at the website. Consider going. It's always a really fantastic, really fantastic and energizing conference as well. And of course, alongside that, do take a look at the digital product management book that these folks have written. So have a fantastic rest of your day, everyone. See you again soon. Thanks, and see you soon. Take care.